Keanu Reeves stood calmly in the first-class queue, his simple attire a stark contrast to the luxury that surrounded him. One man in line couldn't hide his contempt, his arrogance evident in every glance. What happened next would astonish everyone on the flight and profoundly change one person's life. Before we dive further into this story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy narratives like this, be sure to subscribe for another remarkable story tomorrow. The Los Angeles airport buzzed with its usual energy. Voices overlapping, suitcases rolling in every direction, and hurried travelers weaving through the crowd. Amid this chaos, a man stood with quiet composure in the first-class line. That man was Keanu Reeves. His outfit was understated, a plaid shirt, worn jeans, and boots that had clearly seen their share of miles. A weathered backpack hung over his shoulder, suggesting a life filled with travel. There was nothing flashy about him, and for that reason, he mostly blended into the background. But for those who paid closer attention, there was something unmistakably different about him. A calm presence that seemed immune to the frenzy of the airport. While others rushed, Keanu stood still, taking in the scene as though savoring the moment. Standing behind him in line was Victor Harding, who couldn't have been more different. Victor's tailored suit, immaculate shoes, and overpowering cologne all screamed status. Every movement he made was deliberate, as if choreographed to emphasize his importance. His eyes scanned the queue until they landed on Keanu, and a smirk crept onto his face. "First class, huh?" Victor remarked with a condescending smile. "You never know who might show up here these days." Keanu turned to face him, his expression serene. "Yeah," he replied evenly, "the world is full of surprises." Victor, momentarily thrown off, seemed to expect more of a reaction. Displeased by Keanu's indifference, he pressed on. "No offense, but you don't look like the type who flies first class," Victor added with a chuckle. "It's not every day you see someone so casual here." As the first-class line began to move, both men fell silent, tickets in hand, as they followed the procession toward the plane. Victor strode forward with his usual confident swagger, while Keanu maintained his unhurried pace, seemingly unaffected by the bustling crowd. Once on board, an unexpected twist awaited. Victor, checking his ticket again for confirmation, looked up to see Keanu settling into the seat right next to his. "You've got to be kidding me," Victor muttered under his breath, shaking his head in disbelief. He slumped into his seat and let out a soft, incredulous laugh. Out of all the places, it had to be here. Keanu turned to him, his calm expression unbroken. "Looks like we're seatmates," he said with a polite smile. Victor crossed his arms, trying to mask his irritation. It wasn't just the seating arrangement that unsettled him. It was the realization that the man he had so quickly dismissed now shared the same exclusive space. For some reason, Keanu's presence unnerved him, in ways he couldn't quite understand. As the economy passengers continued to board, Victor decided to break the silence, though not in the friendliest way. "So, what do you do for a living?" he asked, his tone casual yet laced with judgment, as though he already had an answer in mind, but wanted confirmation. Keanu, who had been tucking his backpack under the seat in front of him, glanced up and replied simply, "I work in film." Victor raised his eyebrows, feigning surprise. "Oh, I see. Commercials? Indie stuff." Keanu gave a faint smile and shook his head. "Something like that," he replied. Victor chuckled, still failing to grasp the situation. I've always found it fascinating, Victor began, leaning slightly forward. How people try to fit into spaces they don't belong. Take first class, for example. It's not for everyone. Keanu met his gaze calmly, taking a moment to assess before responding in his usual composed manner. I think everyone has their place, he said. And sometimes it's exactly where they are. Victor let out a short laugh. That's a nice thought. Philosophical, even. But real life, it's not that simple. Keanu didn't reply right away. Instead, he turned his attention to the window, signaling the end of the conversation. But Victor wasn't ready to let it go. He leaned closer, his voice dripping with condescension. You know, he said, some places just aren't meant for certain people. Money might buy the seat, but it can't buy belonging. Keanu turned to look at him, his expression steady, a mix of patience and quiet resolve. It wasn't a look of anger, but one that carried more weight than any words. Victor, mistaking Keanu's silence for triumph, leaned back with a smug smile, believing he had won. Yet, beneath Keanu's calm exterior, was something Victor hadn't anticipated. As the plane soared through the clouds and the in-flight service began, a flight attendant moved through first class, offering drinks. Victor made sure to draw attention to himself. Champagne, he said with a practiced grin. Something exclusive, like this seat. The flight attendant, used to passengers like him, responded with a professional nod. When it was Keanu's turn, his request was simple. Just water, please. Victor seized the moment to sneer. Water? He asked, chuckling. You're really going to fly first class and settle for water? Keanu accepted the bottle from the flight attendant, his expression unchanging. I'm fine with this, he replied evenly. Sometimes simplicity is enough. Victor narrowed his eyes, trying to decipher Keanu's calm demeanor. He leaned in, his tone sharp. Yeah, I guess that works for people who settle for less. Not everyone's meant to enjoy the finer things. Keanu took a sip of water, unfazed. The nearby passengers, noticing Victor's antagonistic tone, began to shift uncomfortably, but Keanu's tranquility diffused any tension. Maybe the best is different for everyone, Keanu finally said, his voice steady. Victor frowned, clearly dissatisfied with the response. Or maybe, he countered, people who say that just don't know what the best is, because it's out of their reach. The flight attendant, busy with another passenger, cast a discreet glance toward their row, monitoring the interaction. But Keanu's calm demeanor reassured her that no intervention was needed. He offered nothing more than a slight smile before turning back to the window. Victor, however, wasn't done. His frustration with Keanu's unshakable composure was growing, and it was becoming evident to those around them. While Keanu remained serene, Victor's arrogance was making the other passengers increasingly uncomfortable. Determined to regain the upper hand, Victor raised his champagne glass and started again. You know, life's a lot like flying first class, he said, gesturing with exaggerated flair. You work hard, you earn your spot, and then you enjoy it. But some people, well, they're just lucky to be here. Keanu calmly set his water bottle down and finally turned to face Victor, his expression as composed as ever. Keanu's gaze remained steady, but a subtle shift suggested he was ready to respond more directly. Luck or hard work, he said calmly yet firmly. We all arrive at the same place when the flight lands, don't we? His words, though simple, carried weight, and the nearby passengers, who had been quietly observing, began to pay closer attention. The atmosphere in the cabin grew tense, with an almost uncomfortable silence settling over first class. A few passengers exchanged glances, sensing the understated conflict between the two men. Victor forced a smile, masking the fact that Keanu's response had struck a chord. "Well, I wouldn't go that far. Some of us are clearly operating on a higher level," he retorted. "Not everyone really gets what it means to be here." Keanu leaned forward slightly, crossing his arms. "I think the real value of being here," he said, gesturing around the first-class cabin, "isn't about what you have. It's about how you treat others." The statement lingered in the air like a profound truth, resonating with the nearby passengers. A few nodded in quiet agreement, while others exchanged approving glances. Victor, however, grew visibly uncomfortable. He laughed, attempting to brush off the remark, but his unease was evident. "That's a good one," he said with a forced chuckle. "First-class self-help philosophy. Maybe you should consider giving motivational talks." Keanu responded with a faint smile and turned his gaze forward, signaling the end of the conversation without another word. His silence, paired with his calm presence, spoke volumes. The passengers around them reacted subtly. Some whispered among themselves, while others looked at Victor with disapproving expressions. Toward the back of the cabin, a couple who had recognized Keanu remained quiet, respecting his privacy, but clearly admiring his composure. Meanwhile, Victor began to notice the growing scrutiny from those around him. His once confident posture shifted, but he wasn't ready to admit defeat. He still believed he was in control of the situation, unaware that the tide had turned. What lay ahead, however, would challenge everything Victor thought he understood about status, power, and respect. As the flight attendant passed through the cabin collecting empty glasses, Victor, still determined to win, took another shot. "You know what's funny?" he began. "People who have nothing to show for themselves are always the ones talking about humility and simplicity. Ever notice that?" Keanu leaned forward slightly, meeting Victor's gaze directly. "I've noticed," he replied calmly, "that sometimes the ones who talk the most about what they have are the ones who feel the emptiest inside." The words hung in the air for a few moments, their weight palpable. Victor's smug demeanor faltered, and he seemed momentarily at a loss for words. He opened his mouth to respond but hesitated, struggling to craft a comeback. The surrounding passengers exchanged glances, some visibly impressed by Keanu's ability to handle the provocations with such grace. Victor finally recovered. "Look, I'm not trying to be rude," he said, his tone defensive. "But the world is competitive. If you don't show what you've got, people will ignore you. That's just reality." Keanu leaned back in his seat, his expression unchanged. "Maybe," he said, "but I think true success doesn't need to be shouted about. It speaks for itself." Keanu's words rippled through the cabin, resonating with the passengers. Some nodded subtly in agreement, while others directed disapproving looks at Victor, who was visibly unsettled by the exchange. The once relaxed atmosphere in first class had shifted. Nearly everyone was now paying full attention to the interaction. An older man nearby turned to observe more closely, shaking his head as if to signal disapproval of Victor's behavior. Victor, noticing the stares, tried to mask his irritation, but couldn't back down. Instead, he muttered another jab. "Cheap philosophy. Sounds nice, but the real world doesn't work that way." Keanu turned to him, his expression as tranquil as ever. "The real world," he said evenly, "is made by people. And in the end, how we treat others says more about who we are than anything else." Victor shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confidence fading under the weight of Keanu's words. Victor glanced around the cabin, quickly realizing that the passengers' focus had shifted against him. Some were whispering among themselves, while others openly stared, their expressions a mix of curiosity and quiet judgment. The confidence he had displayed earlier was now faltering. Victor had believed he was in control, but the weight of Keanu's calm and thoughtful responses was subtly altering not just the passenger's perception, but perhaps his own as well. The tension in the cabin was almost tangible. Crossing his arms, Victor tried to project an air of composure, though his irritation was beginning to surface. Meanwhile, Keanu remained unshaken. After a brief silence, he turned to Victor and spoke in his usual calm tone. "You know, Victor, I get what you're saying. The world can be very competitive. But I've learned that the need to prove something to others often comes from something deeper, an insecurity, an inner struggle." Victor frowned, unsure if this was meant to provoke or to open a genuine dialogue. "Inner struggle?" he scoffed, laughing dismissively. "I don't know where you got that idea, but you couldn't be more wrong." Keanu gave a small, knowing smile and shook his head. "Maybe," he replied, "but I've met many people who believed success was all about what others could see. Deep down, though, they were just trying to fill something that was missing." The words struck Victor in an unexpected way, and he fell silent for a moment. His hand drifted unconsciously to the wedding band on his finger, fiddling with it absent-mindedly. But just as quickly, he snapped back into his defensive tone. "That's not me," he retorted. "Everything I have, I worked hard for. I don't need anyone telling me how to live my life." Keanu remained composed, his demeanor thoughtful as he observed Victor. After a moment, he responded, "I'm not saying you didn't work hard. I just think that sometimes we get so caught up in showing off what we've achieved that we forget to look inward. Who are we without all of this?" Victor's expression hardened. He pressed his lips together, visibly uncomfortable, the question clearly hitting a nerve. But he wasn't ready to admit it. With a cynical laugh, he shot back, "Who are we? We're what we build. Without it, we're nothing." Keanu didn't flinch. His gaze remained steady, his tone now more serious. "I disagree," he said. "I think we're defined by what we do for others, not by what we accumulate. In the end, what we show the world matters far less than what we carry inside." He tapped his chest lightly, and his words seemed to ripple through the cabin. Several passengers nodded in agreement, while Victor visibly struggled to maintain his composure. Victor leaned forward, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "That's easy for you to say," he snapped. "You don't know anything about me. You don't know what I've been through to get here." Keanu's voice remained steady and firm, but still gentle. "You're right," he said. "I don't know your story. But I don't need to know it to see that sometimes, when people feel the need to shout about their achievements, it's because they're trying to hide something: fear, insecurity, loneliness." The statement hit Victor like a hammer. He froze, his face flushing with a mix of anger and something else, perhaps shame. His fists clenched as he fought to keep control of himself. But then, with a sudden burst of emotion, Victor stood up abruptly, knocking his empty champagne glass to the floor, You think you're better than me? He shouted, his voice cutting through the stunned silence of the cabin. Sitting there with your clever little phrases, acting like you know everything about life. You don't know a thing about what it's like to live in the real world. The cabin fell silent. Every eye was now on Victor, shocked by his outburst. The flight attendant quickly moved forward, trying to de-escalate the situation. Keanu, however, remained seated, his gaze calm and unyielding. He waited patiently for Victor to finish before responding. I don't think I'm better than you, he said, his tone firm but kind. I just think that sometimes we need to stop and reflect on what really matters. And Victor, he added, his voice steady and sincere, you don't have to prove anything to anyone. Keanu's words seemed to land heavily on Victor. His breathing was labored, but there was something about Keanu's calm voice that compelled him to sit back down. He avoided meeting anyone's gaze, his expression shifting from anger to something closer to defeat. Victor sat in silence, Keanu's words echoing in his mind. He had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable, and in front of so many strangers. But he didn't yet realize that the most humbling moment was still ahead. The flight continued in a heavier silence after the confrontation. Victor remained in his seat, his eyes cast downward, visibly unsettled. Keanu, however, seemed entirely at ease, as though the exchange had never happened. A short while later, the flight attendant approached Keanu with a polite smile, her voice unintentionally commanding the attention of the entire cabin. Mr. Reeves, the captain asked me to let you know that your connection in Tokyo is confirmed. He also sends his best regards. The name Reeves seemed to ripple through first class like a shockwave. Some passengers who had been quietly observing the earlier exchange widened their eyes in recognition. A murmur spread through the cabin as realization dawned. Victor froze, the color draining from his face. Reeves, he muttered, almost inaudibly, as though the name had robbed him of breath. His gaze snapped to Keanu. Keanu. Reeves. Keanu nodded politely to the flight attendant, thanking her without acknowledging the commotion. Then he turned to Victor, his expression calm, almost amused. Is something wrong, Victor? He asked with a faint smile. Victor opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked around nervously, seeing other passengers watching him with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. For the first time, Victor looked genuinely lost. His earlier bravado had evaporated entirely. Stammering, he tried to find the words. I had no idea. I mean, you didn't say who you were, he said, his voice faltering. I didn't know that you were... you. Keanu's tone remained steady, calm but firm. I didn't think it was necessary, he replied. I don't usually use my name as a calling card. Victor hesitated before trying to defend himself. Look, I didn't mean to offend you. I just didn't know who I was talking to. Keanu let out a quiet sigh and leaned forward slightly. Victor, what you said doesn't change just because you now know my name. The truth doesn't depend on who you're speaking to. It depends on how you choose to treat people. The words hung in the air like a weight Victor couldn't escape. He looked at Keanu, then at the other passengers, many of whom were now watching the scene with rapt attention. The humiliation on Victor's face was unmistakable. Keanu broke the silence with a final thought, his tone carrying a quiet authority. You know, Victor, life is hard enough for everyone. The last thing we need is people trying to put others down to make themselves feel bigger. Victor nodded slightly, unable to argue. For the first time, he appeared genuinely reflective. Keanu leaned back in his seat, signaling that the conversation was over. Meanwhile, Victor remained frozen, staring at his hands as though replaying every moment in his mind. The confrontation hadn't just been with Keanu. It was with himself. In trying to humiliate someone else, Victor had inadvertently revealed more about himself than he ever intended. The remainder of the flight passed in a heavy silence. Victor, who had entered the cabin exuding arrogance, now sat quietly, his earlier confidence replaced with something closer to shame. He avoided meeting anyone's eyes, least of all Keanu's. As the minutes ticked by, Victor found himself unable to shake Keanu's words. They were so simple, yet they struck at something deep within him. He began to question his own behavior, recalling the many times he had judged others without ever truly knowing them. "Maybe he's right," Victor murmured under his breath, unaware he had spoken aloud. He glanced at Keanu, who was now calmly reading a book, completely unbothered by what had unfolded. The contrast only deepened the impact of the experience for Victor. Keanu had made no effort to assert himself. His actions alone had spoken volumes. As the plane prepared for landing, Victor finally found the courage to break the silence. He turned to Keanu, his gaze still lowered, and said, "I owe you an apology. Not because of who you are, but because I was arrogant. I acted like a fool." Keanu looked at him with the same calm expression. After a brief pause, he replied, "I appreciate the apology, but more than that, I hope you learned from this." Victor nodded slowly, sensing the weight of those words. They weren't just a response. They were an invitation to grow. Keanu continued, "Sometimes what we search for most in the world is what we find least within ourselves. I hope you figure out what really matters." Victor didn't reply, but Keanu's words lingered in his mind. He realized this moment had the power to spark change within him, if he let it. After disembarking, Victor stood still in the terminal, watching as Keanu walked away. He noticed fans discreetly approaching him, asking for pictures or a moment of his time. Keanu greeted each one with patience and a genuine smile, without any hint of hurry or arrogance. It was clear that his kindness and simplicity came from a place of authenticity. Victor looked down at his own hands and sighed. He understood that something within him needed to change. Keanu's words continued to echo, reminding him that a person's true value isn't measured by their status, but by how they treat others. As Keanu disappeared into the crowd, Victor felt a flicker of something new. Hope. Perhaps their encounter hadn't been a coincidence. Maybe it was a chance to start over. In the end, we all carry the weight of our choices. Choices that define who we are. Are we living to impress others, or striving to become better people? Keanu's words carried an undeniable truth. Success isn't about what you achieve or flaunt, but about the positive impact you leave on the world and the lives you touch. The next time you face a moment of judgment or conflict, remember this. Respect and humility never go out of style. And maybe, just maybe, the change you wish to see in the world starts with you.